Good morning or afternoon or evening or strange middle of the night time, whatever time you're watching this. Hello, this is week 14. We are nearing the end of the semester. We're going to be discussing the fracturing union today. I actually had the opportunity to record this lecture at home. My children are not here, so you won't hear them. But I do have some cats, so hopefully they will respect my work and, like cats do, and be quiet. But you may hear a distant meow, and I just wanted to let you know that that's normal. I am purposefully near cats and not, there aren't any cats in the library at JCC or anything. All right. So let's talk about politics here for a minute. The dispute over the Kansas-Nebraska Act led Northern anti-slavery Whigs and some Northern anti-slavery Democrats to gravitate toward two new parties. One was the American Know Nothing Party, which had emerged in opposition to the surge of mostly Catholic immigrants from Ireland and Germany, nearly 3 million of whom had arrived in the United States between 1845 and 1854. The Know Nothing Party, so called because it began as a secret organization whose members, when asked about its existence, were supposed to respond with, "I know nothing," emerged in 1854. The Know-Nothings embraced nativism, opposition to immigrants, by denying citizenship to newcomers. Many also were opposed to the expansion of slavery and the fanaticism of abolitionists. As your book points out, the Know-Nothings swept the 1854 elections in Massachusetts, electing the governor, all of the state's congressmen, and nearly every member of the state legislature. This reflects the strong anti-immigrant sentiment of the period that allowed the Know-Nothings to enjoy broad political success. The other new party, the Republicans, was formed in February 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin, when the so-called conscience Whigs, those opposed to slavery, split from the Southern pro-slavery Cotton Whigs. The conscience Whigs joined with anti-slavery Democrats and Free Soilers to form a party dedicated to excluding slavery from the Western territories. A young Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln made the transition from Whig to Republican. He said that the passage of Stephen Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act angered him and transformed his views on slavery. Unless the North mobilized to stop the efforts of pro-slavery Southerners, Lincoln believed the future of the Union was endangered. From that moment, he focused on reversing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and preventing the extension of slavery into new territories. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we talked about last time, soon placed Kansas at the center of the increasingly violent debate over slavery. While Nebraska would become a free state, Kansas was up for grabs. According to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the residents of the Kansas Territory were, quote, perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions, meaning slavery, in their own way. The law, however, said nothing about when Kansas could decide about slavery, so each side tried to gain political control over the vast territory. "Come on then, gentlemen of the slave states," New York Senator William Seward taunted. "We will engage in competition for the virgin soil of Kansas, and God give the victory to the side which is stronger in numbers, as it is in the right," he said. South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks accepted the challenge, announcing that, quote, "the fate of the South is to be decided in Kansas." Groups for and against slavery recruited armed emigrants to move to Kansas. When Kansas's first federal governor arrived in 1854, he reported to President Franklin Pierce that Southerners were arriving with a, quote, dogged determination to force slavery into this territory. They came in advance of the election of a territorial legislature in March 1855. So on Election Day, thousands of heavily armed border ruffians from Missouri traveled into Kansas, illegally elected pro-slavery legislators, and vowed to kill every, quote, goddamned abolitionist in the territory. That's what militia leader David Atchison had urged folks to do. As soon as it convened, the territorial legislature expelled its few anti-slavery members and declared that the territory would indeed be open to slavery. The governor then rushed to Washington, D.C. to plead with Pierce to intervene with federal troops. Pierce's spineless solution was to replace the governor with a man who would support the pro-slavery faction. Outraged Free State advocates in Kansas, now a majority, spurned the bogus pro-slavery government and elected their own delegates to a constitutional convention that met in Topeka in 1855. There they applied for statehood and drafted a state constitution that excluded slavery. By 1856, a free state governor and legislature were operating in Topeka. There were now two competing governments claiming to rule the Kansas Territory. Soon there was to be a territorial civil war, which journalists called Bleeding Kansas. In May 1856, a pro-slavery force of more than 500 Missourians, Alabamans, and South Carolinians invaded the free state town of Lawrence, Kansas, just 25 miles from the Missouri border. The mob rampaged through the town, destroying the newspaper printing presses, burning homes, and ransacking shops. Abolitionist John Brown recruited his sons to respond to the sack of Lawrence, as it was called. Brown believed that Christians must, quote, break the jaws of the wicked, and that the wickedest Americans were those who owned and traded slaves. Brown led 4 of his sons and a son-in-law to Pottawatomie, Kansas, a pro-slavery settlement near the Missouri border. On the night of May 24th, the group dragged 5 men from their homes and hacked them to death with swords. The Pottawatomie Massacre launched a brutal guerrilla war in the Kansas Territory. On August 30th, pro-slavery Missourians raided a free state settlement, looting and burning houses. They then shot Frederick Brown, John's son, through the heart. By the end of 1856, about 200 settlers had been killed in Bleeding Kansas. Ultimately, Bleeding Kansas seemed to discredit Stephen Douglas's policy of leaving the decision of slavery to the local population. So again, remember Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty? Something we're going to touch on a little bit later again. So Bleeding Kansas seems to discredit the idea that we can just kind of roll with it and let the people who live in the territory decide whether the state will be free or enslaved because of all the infighting that happens. But violence was not exclusive to the Kansas Territory. On May 22, 1856, an ugly incident in the U.S. Senate shocked the nation. 2 days before, Republican Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a passionate abolitionist, had delivered a scalding speech in which he showered slave owners with insults and charged them with unleashing vigilantes and assassins in Kansas. His most savage attack was directed at Andrew Pickens Butler, an elderly senator from South Carolina. Butler, Sumner charged, was a fumbling old man who had, quote, chosen a mistress, who, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot slavery, he concluded. Sumner's speech outraged Butler's cousin, South Carolina Congressman Preston S. Brooks. On May 22nd, Brooks confronted Sumner as he sat at his Senate desk, shouting that Sumner had slandered Butler and the state of South Carolina. He then began beating Sumner with a gold-knobbed cane. Sumner, his head gushing with blood, nearly died. He would not return to the Senate for almost 4 years. Southerners celebrated Brooks as a hero. The Richmond Enquirer described his attack as, quote, good in conception, better in execution, and best of all in consequences. In satisfying his rage, though, Brooks had created a martyr, Bloodied Sumner, for the anti-slavery cause. Sumner's brutal beating also had an unintended political effect. It drove more Northerners into the Republican Party. The violence of Bleeding Kansas and Bloodied Sumner spilled over into the 1856 presidential election. At its first national convention, the Republicans fastened on to the eccentric, shameless self-promoter John C. Fremont, who had led the conquest of Mexican California. The Republican platform borrowed heavily from the former Whigs. It endorsed federal funding for a transcontinental railroad and other transportation improvements. It denounced the repeal of the Missouri Compromise, the Democratic Party's policy of territorial expansion, and the barbarism of slavery. For the first time, a major party platform had taken a stand against slavery. The Southern-dominated Democrats dumped President Franklin Pierce, who remains the only elected president to be denied renomination by his party. Instead, they chose 65-year-old James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, a mild-mannered former senator and Secretary of State. Their platform endorsed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, called for vigorous enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, and stressed that Congress could not interfere with slavery in states or territories. In the campaign of 1856, the Republicans had few Southern supporters and only a handful of the border slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Vermont swept the northernmost states with 114 electoral votes, but Buchanan added 5 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Illinois, Indiana, and California, to his Southern majority for the total of 174 electoral votes. The Democrats would now control the White House, the Congress, and the Supreme Court. James Buchanan, America's first unmarried president, looked the part of a statesman. He was handsome, had excellent manners, and had built an impressive political career on his commitment to states' rights and his aggressive promotion of territorial expansion. He believed that saving the Union depended upon ignoring abolitionists and making concessions to the South. Republicans charged that he lacked the backbone to stand up to the Southern slaveholders who dominated the Democratic majorities in Congress. Buchanan was one of the most experienced presidents of the 19th century. As it turned out, he had limited abilities as a leader and lots of bad luck. During his first 6 months in office, 3 major events caused his undoing: a sharp downturn in the economy, the Supreme Court decision in Dred Scott, and new troubles in the strife-torn Kansas Territory. The last 2 of those I will talk about, starting with Dred Scott in the second part of the lecture video.